and welcome to The Table. And as a reminder, why is this show called The Table? Well, my name is Barbie Winterbottom, and I have been a human resources professional for many, many years, over 20 years. And throughout my entire career, I continue to hear the statement, we are clamoring, we are fighting for a seat at the table. And once I moved into this role of entrepreneur, HR consultant, coach, and advisor, adjunct CHRO, whatever you want to call me these days, just keep it nice. I decided, you know what? It's time that I build my own table and I invite others to claim their seat and take up space and utilize their voices at the table. So for those of you who hadn't heard that before, that is why my show is called The Table, because it is a safe space and a place for all of us to come together, share our ideas, talk about what's going on in the world of work and people and human resources and D&I and all of the things that impact our workplaces today. So with that, I would like to thank our sponsor, Daily Pay. Again, if you guys have not heard me speak about Daily Pay, it is a phenomenal product. I encourage you to check them out. It allows your employees to access any earned but unpaid wages at any time through a simple, intuitive app on their phone. And the beauty of it is that employers can implement this. It completely and seamlessly integrates with your payroll. There's no extra work for you, and it is a huge benefit. When we speak about DE&I and equity and rewriting the rules of money and helping to change systems that have negatively impacted marginalized people for centuries, Daily Pay is one of the ways that you as an HR professional or as a leadership professional can help change that equity within your own organization by allowing everyone access to their money immediately to help undo some of these systemic issues within the finance world that has impacted those communities. So we thank everyone at Daily Pay for being here, and again, check them out. So what are we talking about today? I am thrilled to bring all of you this session today. This is likely going to be one of the more edgier conversations that we've had. And I'm really excited. As you all know, I am all about authenticity, transparency, and having really direct, meaningful conversations with other people who are also willing to go down those paths with me with respect, dignity, and with purpose. And with that, I am thrilled to introduce to all of you Jared Karol, who is joining us today. The author of this amazing book, A White Guy Confronting Racism, and an invitation to reflect and act. And Jared, welcome to the table, and thank you for being here, and thank you for bringing this to all of us.
Well, thank you, Barbie. You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me, and I loved your intro, your preview. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. So to give everybody a little bit of context, you are your full-time job, right, is you are a senior DE&I specialist for an organization called Translator. Mm-hmm. And then not necessarily on the side, but in addition to, I think this is taking up more than what might be considered a side job. In addition to, you are an author.
Yes.
And you do a lot of facilitation and work independently in the D&I space. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes. And I love how you emphasize facilitation. I like to, as we talked a little bit before we went live, this difference between facilitating and holding space, right? For dialogue, for discussion, for people to bring their concerns, their questions, their comments, and then being like a true kind of educator or presenter. I do some of that, but I really prefer let me come in and hold the space for whatever group it is to have the conversation that needs to be had based on whatever their pain points are.
Yeah, I love that. So let's dive into what prompted you to write this. And I looked to one story. I actually quoted it. Now I'm not going to be able to find it. But it was your 10 minutes that changed my life. I knew I'd find it. Page 73 of your book, right? So it was the number 19 bus in San Francisco. You were leaving Acorn Books on Polk Street near California Street. It was late at night, and the almost empty bus rumbles out of the gulch into the Tenderloin. An older Black man gets on at Geary and sits right next to me. And you share that this 10-minute interaction changed your life. I'd love for you to share with us a little bit more about this interaction and why this was so impactful to you.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing that story up. And it's one of many stories, many incidences that changed my life. But I point to that specifically around race and kind of how this book, a white guy confronting racism, came to be. Because I'm 24, right, as I say in the book, and I'm more than comfortable sharing my age. This was 1997, right? So I'm 48, so it was half a lifetime ago, right? And I just graduated college, maybe a year and a half previously. I was a college athlete. I drank maybe 8 or 9 days a week, most weeks, right? I was that guy, right? I was very privileged. I was very insular in my understanding of the world, in my relationships, in my upbringing. It was very, very white, very straight, very suburban. I grew up in Southern California, San Diego suburbs. And my dad, however, was a gay man. He lived in San Francisco. I started to be more comfortable with him being gay in college a little bit, kind of, but I was kind of just always balancing this, like, well, I'm a star athlete, I'm this party guy. I can't really have a gay dad. That's going to go against my reputation. This whole this whole juggling of these conflicting storylines. And so at this time of the story on this bus, my dad's influence was starting to take an effect on me. Kind of some of the things that he was challenging me to do and be different and more expansive and more curious, etc. But I was still kind of stuck in my, my sports kind of suburban ways. So anyway, I'm on this bus and I go to the bookstore, which I was just starting to be a reader. I wasn't really a reader up until that point, but my dad was. He's like, go to the bookstore. You should check out some books. Okay, cool. So I go to the bookstore. I get on, and this man gets on the bus and he sits right next to me. And this is almost empty bus. And if you've ever been on a bus, well, probably any major city, but in San Francisco, they're like the sideways facing seats at the front. They're usually reserved for elderly folks. So I'm sitting there, and he comes and he sits right next to me. Like, why is this guy sitting right next to me? There's this whole and what turned out was I had this stack of maybe 3 or 4 books. On top was Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison that my dad had suggested. And he said, that's a great book. That book changed my life. I said, oh, really? My dad, recommended to me. So I go, oh, your dad's a smart man. And we just started having this conversation that was born out of just curiosity, out of coincidence, out of serendipity, right? And he's telling me that he grew up in Harlem and with, oppression. And I forget all the details now, 25 years later, but and I was saying, oh, my dad's gay man and he moved in. So we found these similarities between this 24-year-old, clueless white kid and this who knows how old 60-year-old, seasoned Black man. I just remember thinking wow, that's I've been missing that my whole life. These opportunities to connect, to learn, to heal. Frankly, I didn't know this at the time, but now I know, to heal, these missed opportunities to really appreciate and understand and learn from the vast, dynamism of the human condition. Mm-hmm. And so, I look at that incident, and then, so he gets off the bus 10 minutes later. He's like, hey, well, have a great night. Great talking to you. Read that book. It'll change your life too. It's like, whoa, where did this guy come from? And so, it seems so innocuous, so minor. And I guess in some ways it was, and that's kind of the point. But that at the time it was so new and revelatory for me.
Isn't that amazing that just a very short, non-threatening conversation with someone of a different race had that much of an impact on you because you just hadn't done it before?
Well, exactly.
That was your reality, and how that opened up so many more things, right? So it's almost that whole concept of we just have to take the right next step. Mm-hmm. Each and every time, right? We don't have to we can't boil the ocean.
Exactly.
But we can turn up the temperature 1 notch or take one more step each and every day to do something better or differently. And I think that's a great example of just one experience and how that ripple effect has happened for you. And now you've written this amazing book. So what happened that prompted you to write this? Like, what was your impetus that you said, okay, enough, I'm writing this because the world needs to hear my voice in this?
Yeah, gosh. Well, it's not as simple or straightforward as that, but I will get to it in a second. There was kind of a final impetus.
Okay.
But let's fast forward from that incident on the bus in 97 to 2000. So I'm 27, a little bit more seasoned, but still kind of not really doing much to be differently in the world. My dad, as I mentioned, was a gay man. He was HIV positive. He died of AIDS in 2000, September 29th, 2000. So at the time, I was living back in San Diego. I was surfing. I was parking cars at a hotel. It was actually a pretty good life, if I have to, right? It was, but there was there's no accountability. There was no impact on people's lives. I was, wasn't really, I said, it took my dad dying to say, all right, I want to be different. I don't want to be that guy anymore. I want to be what? I didn't even know exactly what I wanted to be, but I wanted to be different. I wanted to be more impactful. So I moved up to the Bay Area, started teaching, taught a social justice curriculum, learned all about power and privilege and equity and history of oppression, stuff that I kind of was starting to maybe understand through my dad and a little bit of the reading that I had, started to do, but really just dove in and decided to really, as much as possible, I don't want to say abandon, but just outgrow my old self. So anyway, fast forward to, so I taught for 12 years, did some other things. Fast forward to a couple of years ago, it was actually fall of 2019, and I had a long-term contract at a big tech company on the D&I team. And it was pretty good. It was corporate. There was some progress, but there was also some, things that were challenging. And I'd kind of been going back and forth between like consulting and hustling for gigs and then having this kind of steady, I think it was about 17, 18-month contract. And it ended, and I said, okay, you know what? I think I want to get a job. I kind of want a job. I tried the consulting thing for a couple of years, got a couple of good contracts, want to get a job. So I hired this resume coach, and he totally helps me reposition myself on my resume. And he gave me all these strategies to, how to do cover letters, how to position myself in interviews. And the first meeting we had, he said, just tell me about yourself. And he just sat and listened to me for about 15 minutes, and he's typing. And he interrupts me. He goes, Jared, in these first 15 minutes, you've said you're a white guy who gets it like 4 times. How come I don't see that anywhere on your resume, on your LinkedIn profile? I said, well, I don't know. I just, I'm kind of, he's like, dude, you got to lead with that. So I'm like, okay. And it wasn't that I was like afraid. I was just kind of like, hadn't thought of to really own it. So I started owning it. So anyway, fast forward, that was our first session. Fast forward to our 4th session. And he got my resume shaped up. I'm ready to go. I've got a strategy. And my last session, I remember it was December 18th, 2019. So just remember where we are, December of 2019. COVID doesn't exist yet. Well, actually it did, but it didn't exist as we know it, right?
Right.
The year of racial reckoning of 2020 hadn't happened. The shit hadn't hit the fan yet, right? And so he says, we just positioned you as this storyteller, as this communications guy, as this facilitator. How come I don't see you writing anything on LinkedIn? I said, well, I don't know. I just been kind of lazy. He said, do you got something to say? I said, yeah. He said, open up your laptop right now and write a post. Okay. Write a post, hit publish. And he said, I want you to write something every day until you get a job. I'm like, okay, done. So I started writing every day, December, January, February, March, applying for jobs, getting good interviews. And then COVID really came in March, and it just kind of the whole process. So I didn't get the job, but I did keep writing. And I started to get more people interested, more people appreciating what I was doing, giving me validation, challenging me, right? I was learning, I was tweaking, but I just kept writing. And by like May or June of 2020, some people started saying, you got to write a book, put this stuff into a book. I was like, that's a big project, right? But, over the course of basically the rest of 2020, the good-natured pressure kind of won out. And so I started organizing it. And by the end of 2020, like early 21, I had about 300 what I call vignettes. And so now the task was looking at them and organizing them and seeing what I had. So I did all the whole thing and organized them, got a publisher, an editor, kind of shaped it all up, and boom, a book.
Here we are. That's fantastic. I love that. What I love about that is that you really illustrate how anyone can do this if they have something meaningful to share. That it's a series of efforts, that it's not like all of a sudden you sat down one day and said, okay, I'm going to block the week and I'm going to write a book, right? I'm going to block the month, right? It was a series of just showing up every day and putting something together. And then after a period of time, you now have this published, collection of stories and vignettes. And I love that. As someone who is struggling to get her book written, because
it's hard. It is hard. And I have all of it, right? But putting it together and doing what you did is the challenge that I'm facing. So I completely appreciate your approach. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Wonderful. So when we look at the way I want to have the conversation about, we are two white people right now utilizing a platform that truly anybody can use, right? It's free. It's a free streaming platform. So there's no real cost involved in it. There's access for anybody who wants to, but there are folks out there who would say, you two have no business having this conversation about racism because neither one of you are in a minority from a race perspective. At least visually, we're not, right? Nobody, I guess, knows necessarily what our ancestral heritage is, but visually, looking at us, we don't look like people who have the right to talk about racism or to educate others about racism. And I know, as you mentioned, we had a bit of a prep before we went live just to get on the same page and make sure we were comfortable, having a dialogue, but we haven't rehearsed responses. And I do want people to understand that. Yes. So I want this conversation to be as open as possible, and it may have unpopular opinions, and that's okay as well. I think that's part of the beauty of having my weekly show, is that we hear different ideas and opinions and experiences from people. But I think it's really brave of you to step forward and write content about racism as a white person. And I like your perspective, right? It's confronting it. So you're not saying that you've been a victim of, you're not positioning yourself as the one and only expert, but you're giving your perspective on what you've observed, what you've experienced, and then perhaps some things that other white people or non-minority people can do to address racism and be an advocate, and an ally for those who might need someone to stand with them and someone to help amplify their voice. So talk to me about how you have, how have you created this body of work and this space as a white person when there's a lot of criticism out there in the world, and you and I both see it on LinkedIn almost every day. There is a belief that white people have no business in this space. And I'd love to hear your perspective on it, because I don't necessarily think anybody's right or wrong. I think it's just different viewpoints. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Gosh, so many different ways to go, Barbie. And I love this. This is a meta conversation for me. Having the conversation about how we have the conversation, I think, is so important. Now, it can't be the only thing, or else nothing ever gets kind of, moved forward. But it's so important to have these conversations. So a couple things. One is, I know what I'm talking about. And a lot of other white people know what they're talking about. Doesn't mean, there's a difference between confidence and arrogance. Yeah. But there's also a difference between humility and meekness, right? And so how do we, as white folks, individually and collectively, have the conviction to speak up, to share our experiences, to educate, to raise awareness in whatever our spheres of influence, whether it's online, our neighborhoods, our families, our communities, our workplaces, right? How do we educate and speak up with the confidence that we know what we're talking about? And that when I say I know what I'm talking about, doesn't mean I don't make mistakes, doesn't mean I'm never wrong, doesn't mean I don't mess up. Of course I do, but I know generally what I'm talking about because I've read, I've listened, I've absorbed, I've committed to doing this work. When I say this work, I mean for myself, like my self-development work, right? Unpacking my history, evolving my consciousness, but also when I say the work, like, learning about, when I shared that story, about the man on the bus, I was, 24. I didn't know. Yeah, I knew, there was slavery, and I knew there was Jim Crow, and I knew, the kind of general stuff that American kids are taught or are not taught, frankly. But I didn't really know people and what their lived experiences were and what their emotional responses and everyday experiences were like. And so I've done all that work, and I continue to do all that work. And so I think what we see is this kind of a gatekeeping, and this isn't just for Black people or just for people of color. I think a lot of people do this in all kinds of industries, but in this kind of field, we see a lot of gatekeeping of knowledge of like the right thing to do or the right way to do it or the right people to do it. And I think that's unfortunate. I also think there's a lot of weaponizing of truth or weaponizing of perspectives. So what I'm careful to do, or mindful of doing, is here's how I'm going to share my perspective and show up in these spaces. I don't come in, as you kind of alluded to, I don't come in as the expert. I don't come in as someone who's experienced directly, racism in my life. I haven't. Right? So I'm going to share these stories, like the guy on the bus, like dozens, hundreds of other stories that are in the book, right? Of different things that have happened to me, that I've learned from, that I've, been witness to, that I've been a perpetrator of, right? And the thing is, white folks need to be having these conversations with other white folks, or else it's not going to change. So Black folks cannot, and other people of color cannot be the only ones who are educating people. That's a big burden, right? And so I don't know if you're familiar, if people listening are familiar with Resmaa Menakem. He wrote the book, My Grandmother's Hands. He's got a new book. I'm not sure if it's quite out yet. I think it's out maybe in a couple months. But he does a lot of work with intergenerational trauma and healing. And he says, like, white folks, you got to get with your people. You got to get with your people for like 3 to 10 years and thresh this stuff out and figure out so that we can show up in the world more impactful, more respectfully, with more humility, with more integrity, right? And so I think the complaint that you kind of bring up, it's not that it's invalid, it's very valid, but it's more nuanced than that. So how do we as white people show up in these conversations with integrity, with purpose, so that we're actually we're changing narratives, we're changing the conversation for the better, and not perpetuating white supremacy and the narrative of the privileged majority, right? Are we disrupting or are we perpetuating it? So these are the types of things we have to think about. Now, not everyone, I'm not saying every white person should go out and do it, like do your work, but show up in a way that has conviction and humility kind of woven into each other.
I love that. And I think it's huge. Over the past several weeks, all of my guests, in honor of Black History Month, I wanted to be intentional about amplifying Black voices. And it's not that I only do it during the month of February, but I really wanted to, honor the history there, and then the contributions of amazing Americans throughout history. And I think it's one of the things that I recognize, or a few things that I've recognized through those conversations, is that truth and facts are not the same.
Exactly.
And so as you alluded to, talking about what we are taught in school is someone's truth, but not necessarily facts, right? What we are taught in school about slavery, what we are taught in school about the history of the U.S. and race relations is not necessarily factual as it relates to all the people who are impacted. It's a very singular lens, sadly. And I think we're starting to open that up a little bit, but then now, at least here in Florida, there are these like "don't say gay" bills out there. I don't even know if you've heard about this one or not.
I have, yeah.
So we're trying to additionally, silence or quiet the facts and the lived truths of people historically, whether they're Black, Asian, white, gay, trans, whatever that lived reality might be, we're trying to contrive the way in which that history is repeated and shared. So I think one of my big takeaways is understanding that there's a huge difference between truth and facts, and we can only see truth through our own lived experience in our eyes. And we can ask people for what their truth is, but will we ever experience it? Likely not, because we are not that person, right? You and I are two white people. I can't live your truth, nor can you live mine, but I can lead with curiosity. And I think that's another big thing that I've really taken away from these conversations over the past few weeks is if we go about wanting to learn with the right framework, because we're genuinely curious about how we can make a difference. And I love that that's a huge part of your focus in your book, is talking about what we can do, right? So you're the takeaway that I get from reading your book and from our conversation is that you're not positioning yourself as the expert on race relations or as the expert about the lived experience of Black men and women and trans folks in the US or around the globe. What you are saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I absolutely don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I interpret you saying is that what I am here to do is to say, hey, white people, pay attention, because we can help. We can do things. We can be allies. We can be advocates. And I really loved that on page 203. When you say these things, you look silly and racist. I love that you're that direct, right? And I just had a conversation with Kim Sullivan, who's the CHRO of Concentrics, yesterday, and we will be producing her show and sharing it. But we were talking about hair, right? And I have naturally very curly hair, but typically I blow it out straight, because years ago in the workplace, a white man, middle-aged white man, came up to me and said, can you do something with that? Like smooth out that hair. It just doesn't look professional. And it took me, that was probably like your experience 20 some odd years ago. It took me until yesterday, because I didn't have time to blow out my hair and I was filming this show with Kim Sullivan, to realize that in that moment, I knew what it felt like. I was experiencing that whole natural hair in the workplace is not professional conversation that so many Black women face on a day-to-day basis. And I never connected those dots before. Yeah. And I was like, so I do have glimpses into what that lived experience could be like. I had a Black foster child for a while, and I saw what he dealt with on a day-to-day basis. I had to walk to school with him so that he didn't get pulled over by police for walking in a white neighborhood. So I have exposure to that. And then I think what you're really calling out here is, once you have exposure to it, what the hell do you do about it? Yeah. And what do you take away, and how do you then become an advocate?
So well said, Barbie, in so many different directions. And I think you're right. Like this idea that, so the way I look at it, because yes, I'm a former teacher, and you can call, you hear this phrase like antiracist educator, right? People sometimes will use that phrase, for their own title. And you hear white people, well, my anti-racist educator says, right? So fine, whatever. I don't refer to myself as that, but I guess I am in that realm, right? Like I do, even this, like what we're doing right now is education, right? Whatever my approach is kind of with a goal of raising awareness, of educating, of accelerating fluency, right? And I've kind of have this, it's not really codified anywhere, but it's kind of this mental model of like, we observe. Actually, let me back up. We absorb, right? We absorb what's going on around us. We read, we listen, we go to events, we follow people on social media, we absorb perspectives, things we didn't know, things we did know, but we just heard a little, different take or an expanded take. We keep absorbing all this, and it becomes kind of, like how we think. And sometimes we can't always even name it or point to it or give credit to it. It's just like, oh, I don't know where I learned that, but this is what I believe, right? So this absorption. Then simultaneously, we're also observing. We're observing what's going on in politics, in the news, in media and entertainment at work, with our kids at school, in our neighborhoods. We're observing all these trends and these behaviors and these inequities, right? So we're absorbing, like learning, and we're observing, and then we're making that connection. And so I think that's like the book is really about that connection. What have you been absorbing your whole life? And what have you been observing, and how are you connecting those two so that you can act, so that you can make commitments and investments in change, in relationships, in disrupting systems, etc. Because I think a lot of times we want to just go straight to the act. We want to go like social justice, boom, this is wrong, you're doing it wrong. And that doesn't really work, because either the people who are being whatever it is, accused, vilified, right? They're either going to, what are they going to do? They're either going to go like, screw you, I'm not listening to you. They're going to feel guilty and shamed, and they're going to, kind of slide off into nothingness, right? Or like this percentage of people going like, thank you for, knocking me upside the head, and now I'm going to change. That percentage of people is very small. Mm-hmm. So while social justice is the foundation and has to be, we have to understand that the reason this work is important is because there's so much social injustice and inequity and marginalization and oppression. That can't be the only thing. We have to center EQ, right? Awareness, curiosity, vulnerability, right? We have to center mindfulness. How do we sit with uncertainty when we're stressed, when we're angry, when there's ambiguity, right? And we have to center storytelling. How do we tell our own story? How do we amplify voices, you said earlier, that aren't being amplified? How do we work individually and collectively to create new narratives that are true, that have been repressed, that have been hidden, that have been ignored? And so there's this, it can't just be social justice, because people don't get it. And so there have to be ways to help them get it.
And I imagine, and no one has said this to me, and so this is just an observation and an assumption. If there was any part of me that could put myself in the shoes or in the seat of a person of color or a marginalized group and think, Jared, that sounds great. Isn't it lovely that you get to sit back and observe and then process what you choose and dismiss what you choose not to process, and that you get to take the time to influence those who may or may not be open to change. But here I am in my skin, and I am a Black person. Maybe I'm a very dark-skinned Black person. And we know that there are shades, right, of discrimination that goes along with the pigment of your skin, which is incredibly disheartening, but it is a reality. And I don't want to pretend that things don't exist when they do. But I would imagine the level of frustration that Black people feel in some ways when they see this type of conversation, because in many ways, it is the very definition of privilege, because you and I get to sit here and have this conversation about, first, let's observe, and then let's absorb, and then let's figure out a plan, and then let's work out our strategy, which is absolutely, I think, imperative for us to be the advocates and the allies we need to be. Because as you said, jumping in to the end of the game and just out there shaking your fists and your pom-poms isn't always going to truly make a difference. But the irony of this conversation is not lost on me, because for how many hundreds or thousands of years have these oppressed populations continued just to fight for survival? And we get the privilege to sit around and think and talk about it. And so I would imagine that also is baked into the perspective that some folks have as to why we're not the right people to be in this space. But I love how you presented it, because I do think that we have to have a well thought out approach to be the allies and advocates we can be, while recognizing that, yes, we have privilege and we're choosing to use it to help amplify voices and marginalized groups. And you may or may not agree with our approach, but perhaps you can have enough grace and space to allow us to try.
Yeah. Wow, Barbie, so many good points. And I think it's like anything. We are not the only right people to be having this conversation. So if we were saying, or if any white person is saying, like, I'm the only person to be having, then, like, dude, get out of here. Like, that's ego driven, that's short-sighted, that's wrong, right? And so I think, like, if you go to my website, right, I'm a speaker, so of course I'm going to say, hey, like, hire me as a speaker. Like, here's what I offer. Here's the things I talk about, the way I talk about it. And I put on there, and it says, I might be the right speaker for you, and I might not be. So if you're looking for a Black speaker, here's the Black speaker collection put on, founded by Madison Butler, who wrote the foreword to my book. And I don't even know what the current numbers are. I think on my website it says like 1,000. I think it's over like 2,000.
Over 1,000,
right? So it's this idea of like the expandable pie, right? So I think there's a zero-sum game, in so many facets of society, right? But especially in this space, that there's only a limited amount of pieces of pie to go around, and once they're all eaten, then we're done. But the pie is actually expandable. Grandma will make more pie, right? We can keep eating the pie, and so I think the work of white folks is to show up with intentionality, with purpose, with conviction, with integrity, and with humility. And if you don't mind, I want to read a piece that I think speaks to kind of what you were talking about.
I'd love for you to.
And for those following along, it's on page 19. It's called "The Alternative is Silence." As a cisgender straight white male doing anti-racism, social justice, and equity work, absorbing criticism, skepticism, and cynicism is high on my list of skills. After all, who is this cis person to talk about transgender issues? If I were trans, I'd have my doubts about myself. Who is this straight person to be a vocal advocate for gay and lesbian rights? What the hell do I know about what it means to be gay? And who is this white dude to be carrying on about the Black experience, the guy who's as white as snow? And here's another man coming to save all the women from marginalization. All of these and more are valid perspectives. I would be a fool to dismiss them, and I would lose my effectiveness. I put myself out there, I show up, I listen, I speak and write and persuade and argue and try to influence. And because I put myself out there are times when I make mistakes, when I miss nuances and subtleties, when I misrepresent facts, when I'm misinterpreted and misperceived, and when I'm flat out wrong. My intentions aren't always in line with the impact of my words, thoughts, and actions. And this is okay, as long as I'm humble enough to listen and learn and commit to improving. The alternative is silence, and then I'd be complicit.
That is so powerful. I've read that page. I actually have it dog-eared in my book. I've read that page so many times because it's so true, right? I love that you put that out there. And I think that's kind of what I was alluding to when I was talking about how there are a lot of folks who are very critical of white people working in the D&I space. And not every white person should be working in D&I. Not every Black person should be working in D&I. Not every, right? We can't use those huge wide brushes to paint everyone. And I love how you put this out there because you're trying. You're doing the best you can with the right intention, and you're going to get it wrong sometimes. We all do. I get it wrong all the time. And it's funny that I say that, and people have asked me, they're like, you've said that publicly a lot, and yet people pay you to coach and to consult and they pay you money, but you talk about your mistakes. And I'm like, yeah, I do, because guess what? I'm human, and we all make them. But at least my intention is always on the right path, trying to make things better and do the right thing for as many people as I possibly can. And you just capture it so eloquently here that I really feel like this should be a poster. captions of it, because acknowledging that we're not always going to get it right is so huge, but we're trying, and that's what matters so much. And we have to be willing to put ourselves out there.
Yeah. Well, quick story. I know we're running up against time here, but so George Floyd was murdered May 25th. It was Memorial Day of 2020. Coincidentally, the same day that Amy Cooper weaponized her privilege against Christian Cooper when she called 911 on him in New York City.
I did not realize that was the same day.
Yeah, it was the same day.
Oh.
So fast forward about 2 weeks, and I had been talking with a big tech company about coming on to do some long-term consulting, like in kind of April, May, and it just kind of it was having trouble getting started. It didn't happen. Fast forward after this, my contact, she's called me back. She's like, "It's on. Like, we need you. Come in." And the work I was coming in to do was to facilitate these conversations with mostly, not only, but the bulk of my work was to facilitate conversations with white male leadership, and then it was almost like it needed to have this horrific, public murder for them to go, "Oh, yeah, that guy you were talking about? Yeah, can you bring him in?" So I come in, and the CEO had written, like many CEOs did, like that week, right? Had written, I'd say, as far as CEO statements go, decent, maybe a 6 out of a 10, right? Like it was performative, but it was okay. Right. And one of the things he was saying, he's like, let's take care of each other. And by the way, the CEO wasn't a South Asian, an Indian man. So he wasn't black, but he wasn't white. So anyway, so he writes this thing to the employees, and it was public, right, on the website. He says, hey, let's take care of each other. Let's talk to our black colleagues, our black friends. Let's support them. Let's check in, see how they're doing. Right. And so it was well-intentioned. And what happened was several managers in this company, 10,000 people, tech company, right? Several managers come in and they're like, well, hey, the CEO said it, so I'm going to do this. Hey, team, let's have a conversation. And it went south really quickly because they didn't know how to have the conversation. So they took this invitation from the CEO seriously. They wanted to do it. They tried to do it. It didn't go well because they didn't have the experience and the fluency to handle the nuances, the pushback, the anger, all the things. And so I came in, and one of the first things I did was talk with some of these couple people who had tried, white men who had tried to have these conversations. I learned what they did, what didn't work. I came in, I said, well, can we try it again? He said, please. So I came in and I facilitated those conversations. And, did we solve, racism in those conversations? No. But we had a little bit more shared understanding and appreciation of what was really going on, and some things to focus on moving forward as we relate with each other. So I share that not to pat myself on the back, but to say white people need to be in these conversations, and those of us who are qualified and who are skilled and who are committed need to be leading them with the right people, because not everyone can do it.
I love that perspective. And of course, as we're recording, there's lawn people outside. Now my dog's barking, so I apologize for all the background noise. Midgie. One of the things I love about what you're saying is that we have to hold space. And based on that experience, one of the things, one of my questions for you is, you can't be everywhere. Now, people can certainly hire you, correct? So if
they can, yeah.
If you go to jaredkarol.com, or if you go to A White Guy Confronting Racism, you can get in touch with Jared, or even on LinkedIn, and you can invite him into your organization. But there's not enough of you to go around. It's simply impossible for you to be in every organization around the US or around the globe. So if you have a company who says, like the example you just shared, we want to have some of these conversations, what would be, 3 things that you would recommend we do before, in preparation to have these conversations, if they can't bring you in?
Yeah.
And are there places within your book, perhaps you would guide them to read X, Y, and Z first, or other books or other resources to say, prepare yourself for this? And I'll give you an example of where I'm going with this, and that might help you. I had an organization reach out to me, and their company wouldn't invest. It's not that they didn't have the money, but their CEO was not willing to invest the money. And they said, is there anything we can do? So my coaching to them was, well, in the absence of a budget, one of the things you don't want to do is put the burden of responsibility on the shoulders of your Black employees, because they've already been carrying the burden. And so simply saying we're going to stand up ERG groups is not going to do it, because what ends up happening, as you know and I know, is there's a Black ERG group, there's a female ERG group, there's a gay ERG group. And guess what? It's gay people in the gay one, it's Black people in the Black one, it's women in the other. It's not going anywhere. It's not doing anything, right? But perhaps you could meet with the Black folks in your organization who are willing to have a conversation with you, to share with you what their lived experience actually is like within your organization, and get a sense of what the struggle is, get a sense of their experience, so then you can formulate some plans to address some of those things before you go out to the larger group. But don't put them on the spot in that meeting, in that moment, to have to carry the weight. I could have been wrong with that coaching. Like I said, I do things wrong a lot. But I'd love to know your perspective of what could people do in the absence of there.
So I think everything you described is right on, kind of philosophically, right? And I think I heard a little bit of this, but I'll just pull it out just to kind of name it, is this idea that whether you're the CEO or senior leadership or whatever kind of highly visible role that, decision makers, communicators have, right, is change the mindset from like I or we, the leadership, the executive suite, whoever that body is, like change the mindset from like, we have to solve this and we have to have the answers. So change from that mindset to, we hear you. We're listening. We know things are tough right now. We want to change the culture. We acknowledge your suffering. We not accept like it's okay, but we understand that the different people have different lived realities at this company, in the world, etc. So that acknowledgement needs to come first, because what a lot of, and I would even argue well-meaning CEOs, senior executives, VP, people, managers will do, they'll say like, well, this is a safe space. And, this, I don't stand for this. And they make all these declarations that they think are the right things to do. They think that shows commitment, shows, I don't know, whatever, solidarity, allyship. And maybe it does a little bit, but it's not sustainable. Because what does that mean if I say this is a safe space? You can't declare something to be a safe space. What you can say is, we understand that this isn't necessarily a safe space for people in our whatever community because of X, whatever has happened. And, we are working towards making it a more inclusive environment. So there has to be that humility and that vulnerability that we don't have the answers. We're not a finished product, and we never will be, but we're working towards it. And it has to be over time. Because even that, if I'm looking, I'm like, oh, really, dude? If I'm a Black man, I'm like, oh, really? Really, white man CEO? Yep. So you have to absorb that and go, hey, I get it. And then just over time, prove it with your actions.
Yes, I love that. And I love that you said it's not, we're never done, right? If you're looking at DE&I or DEIB or whatever acronym you want to use, because there's many now. It's like the LGBTQ plus AI plus, right? We have all the acronyms these days. But regardless, if you're looking at it as an initiative, as a thing that, we're going to pull this off the shelf today and we're going to do this today and then we're going to put it back and then next week when we have our meeting, we're going to pull it off again, then it's never actually going to transform anything. It's never actually going to be integrated into the DNA of your organization. So the way you approach it is, we're learning and we're having the conversation. And what is your reality today? And what was it last week? And what would you like it to be? I think that's what we miss often, is we talk about what's broken today or what the experience is, but help us understand what would feel better to you, and ask people what that would look and feel like. And it doesn't mean we can wave a magic wand and make it happen tomorrow, but at least hearing Because again, I think this is where as white people or non-minority people, we often make assumptions about what fixed looks like, what better looks like, because again, we're looking at it through our lens. But let's ask the people who we're trying to advocate for and to partner with, what does better look like to you? And then how can I help bring better forward?
Yeah.
And that's huge, right? And we don't do that enough.
Yeah. Well, and the subtitle of the book very intentionally was called An Invitation. So an invitation, not a command, not a demand, an invitation to reflect, right? And act. Not to act, to reflect and act. And it doesn't have to be, reflect first, then act. It's all interwoven, right? We're reflecting, we're continuing to learn, and then we're acting based on those reflections, and then we're making changes and we're making mistakes and we're correcting them, and we're learning new things, right? So this reflection piece, there's a thing called action bias, right? It's like you can't, a lot of people in power, right? They're used to just getting stuff done, yesterday, and like, tell me what to do. Okay, we did that. And that maybe has some impact. Maybe it's positive in the short term, but it's this feeling like, oh, well, I've done something, so now I'm done. It's like,
it's the feeling of this was broken. And this is what I see a lot. And anyone watching, if you are not white, I'd love your perspective on this. But what I have seen happen is that I'm the white person. I come in, I fix it. It was broken. I asked the question. I'm the hero. I came in and fixed it based on what I think needs to be fixed. Right. And yet, did I actually solve the problems? Did I actually advocate for those people who needed my help, or did I do it to make myself feel better?
Exactly.
And that's what I see so often, right? Is that we jump in, to your point, and we act without the reflection, without the proper centering of what we're solving for and why we're doing it, because ultimately it's just to make ourselves look and feel better. And that, I think, is incredibly important in this work, and
totally.
And why your voice and your words in this book are so valuable, because it is about doing it for the right reasons, not about me being the hero.
Exactly. If anyone, especially white folks, are doing this to be the hero, then that's I think that's problematic, right? So,
yeah, because we've caused the problem. Right. It's like when I do work with HR teams and transformation in the HR space, a lot of HR practitioners are rewarded by that feeling of being a hero and being the firefighter. And what I try to illustrate for folks is that there's a certain amount of that's okay. We all like to feel good about the work we do and about helping others. So I get that. But make sure you're not the person walking by the pile of dried sticks and dropping the match, so that you can then come back and be the hero.
Exactly. I love what Kit said in the comment here. Like, you need to have a love of people first.
Yes.
And then, right? So it's like there does need to be that social justice background, but it's like, change happens in relationships. I think anyone, I'm assuming, Barbie, anyone who is really doing HR like how it should be done, not like no, don't go to HR, not those people, right? But like it's about people and changing in one-on-one relationships, collective relationships, organizational, societal. It happens in relationships. So if you're not centering the relationship part of it, you're missing the nuances of what actually needs to be, what people want to have change.
Yes.
So.
And that doesn't always mean that it's a series that you do nothing but have one-on-one conversations all day. But you have those conversations, you listen, you take in that information, you acknowledge that person's experience, and then you take it back and you say, okay, what are the tools, systems, and infrastructure in place that is supporting or leading to that outcome that we can then change to create a different or better outcome. And I think that's often the missing piece that we see a lot of preaching in this
Mm-hmm.
work. We see a lot of folks saying, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong. And yet we're not operationalizing the solutions. We're just talking about everything we're doing wrong. And I love that you come forward and say, here's what I see happening that is not cool. And here's what I've heard from other people. Here are the stories that support all of this. And here are some things that you can do. So you actually lay out, somewhat of a roadmap for people
Exactly.
to fix it, instead of just sitting in the conversation, which is important. Those conversations are important. But if we don't action and get beyond the conversation, we're going to be having this exact conversation, 5 years from now, which is what I think is probably really frustrating for a lot of marginalized folks, is that how many hundreds or thousands of years have we been having this conversation about race and not seeing changes? And I so love everything that you've done here, because you've taken it to a new level with someone who truly defines what we can do to be an advocate. Like Ibram X. Kendi in his book, and I mean, I love his work, and man, that he is brilliant. His brain scares me how smart this man is. But he talks about, the opposite of being a racist isn't passive, it's anti-racist.
Mm-hmm.
And you really spell that out so clearly about, here's what being an anti-racist looks like, white people. And this is your opportunity. Like, if you don't know, if you can't figure it out on your own, what some things you could do or a way to approach it, here's a very non-threatening, but very direct and transparent guide for you. And I hope that this book makes its way into schools. And it may not, because of, I don't know, I've read it. I'm not offended by any of the language in here. I'd have to reread it to see. But at least at the high school level, I think there's so much value.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think one thing I'd say about that, right, is having the conversations, and me or whoever the consultant is, or the specialist who comes in, yes, we want to have kind of ideas and frameworks and approaches and actions to move forward. And part of what I emphasize is, how do I hold the space and facilitate so that the people, whatever the context is, like I'm working with a client right now, and there's like a DEI council. I think there are about 15 of them. And they're frustrated trying to do their work, and they're all, they all have day jobs, but they're part of this DEI council, unpaid, of course, right? And they're trying to, we're getting a lot of resistance, right? We're getting a lot of resistance to the initiatives we're trying to put forward, the movement, the programs we're trying to implement. And so what I'm working with them is like, hey, I have some ideas, but first I need to understand your pain points, some of the specific scenarios you're talking about. Tell me about it. Here's some things you might want to consider, why people are resisting, because people think there's a meritocracy, because people don't understand the difference between equity and equality, because people, there are all these reasons. So let me introduce those into the conversation. Let me hear your concerns, your stories, your pain points, your specific scenarios. And then, so we've had one session on Thursday, we're having our second session, where it's gonna be like, all right, what do you all, how can I help you all come up with the solutions? As opposed to me like, well, so I've listened to what you've said, and I think you should do 1, 2, 3, 4. Like, it needs to be co-created with my guidance and facilitation, but I don't work there. I've known these people for, 90 minutes.
Right.
Like, I don't know. I mean, all I can do is listen and learn and try and understand and take my understanding of what happens generally in organizations and apply it here. But really, my job is to get to a place where they can come up with the solutions themselves, and I help tweak them and refine them so that they have actions moving forward to what they can do. And I think that's a subtle difference. It's, any good coach. I mean, I consider myself a coach, even if I'm coaching, a group of 15 people. It's like still kind of that coaching mindset, right? So any good coach, tells you what you already know, right? So
I love that. And I like that your approach is also, I grew up in a very small southern town here in Florida. And, 2 years ago, when the social injustice and the murders were at the forefront, and what's mind-boggling to me is it's not the first time this has happened. It's been happening, and I'm grateful that we are paying attention more now than we ever have in the past. But it's not like George Floyd was the first Black man ever murdered unjustly, right? We've known this for a while now, especially those of us who have grown up in certain geographies where things haven't been as progressive as maybe other locations and other geographies. But when this started happening and the term privilege started really swirling into the zeitgeist of society, I would see on Facebook and different social medias, folks I grew up with who I considered friends, just railing against, how dare you say I'm privileged? I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I've worked for everything I have, and nobody's handed me anything, and privilege doesn't exist. And there's a huge population of people out there who believe privilege doesn't exist because they don't really understand the definition in context to race and inequality and marginalized populations. And I love how directly you address that in your book. And I think that one of the competitive advantages you do have as a white person in this space is that you can call out other white people on the BS.
Yeah.
And I have done the same. I'm like, you're nuts if you don't think you have privilege. Right. And breaking it down to, you can walk down the street at night without worrying about being shot. You don't think twice about putting on a hoodie and going for a jog at dusk because you're white. Do you know a Black man on this planet today who would be comfortable in any neighborhood at any time, putting on a hoodie and going for a run at night and literally not thinking about it? But would you think twice about it? Would I think twice about it? And really explaining to people what we mean when we say privilege. It's privilege to live freely without the burden of, am I going to get killed for this? Am I going to get arrested for this? Am I going to get spat on for this? Am I going to get, who knows what other horrendous things can happen to people? We're not talking solely about financial privilege. And you address it so head on and so beautifully. And I love that. And I hope that people understand that is an advantage. In this world of D&I, there's room for a lot of us to do the work we can do from our vantage point. And at no point are you or am I saying, I completely understand what it's like to be a Black person in this world. We do not. And I don't ever think we would overstep that boundary. But we do use what we can to bring as much awareness as possible. And I applaud everything that you are doing. I just want to look at comments because there's been comments I haven't had a chance to get to. So thank you, everybody. We are over time, but if you guys have any specific questions for Jared while we're wrapping up, please throw them into the comments right now. We will get to as many as we can. Lionel says, how can we get Jared's book into the schools? I don't know that answer. I really don't. Perhaps by giving a copy to the principal of the school. I don't know how any of that works. I wish I did, but sincerely.
Yeah, Lionel, great question. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to have a conversation there. I don't know kind of, largely like large scale kind of how to do it, but I do know because I have kids myself who are in middle school. It's all about relationships. So, it's finding schools and people within schools, principals, teachers who do get it and who are interested. I live in California. I live in Oakland. It's a much more progressive kind of place. There,
right.
We don't have a lot of the restrictions, like I know you in Florida, Barbie, and, other places, right? Texas, there are lots of restrictions. So I don't know where you live, Lionel, but I'm more than happy, and not just to sell more books, but to strategize with people one-on-one. Say, hey, tell me about your situation. Where do you live? What schools are we talking about? Who are the people? It's really kind of similar to like in organizations, right? Who are the people who do get it, and who you can start having conversations about? Like maybe they're not the most senior person, maybe they're not the ultimate decision maker, but they're sympathetic to the cause. You start to have a conversation. Here's what we want to do. What do you think, knowing what you know about your organization, what steps do we need to take to make this happen? Oh, well, the principal's not going to go for it, but the vice principal, she's down. Okay, let's go talk to her, right? So you find those relationships, and you still may, in the end, be met with an ultimate decision maker who says no and has the authority. Okay, right? But you build coalitions, you build collaboration with people who are invested. Detroit, thank you, Lionel. right? So yeah, I mean, that's what I'm all about. It's, as I said, it's not scalable necessarily, but it's at this level for me, I'm more interested in individual people who are interested in this and who have connections to places where we can start to kind of almost like guerrilla marketing, like start to get it here, start to get a little here, start to get a little here. All of a sudden, oh, hey, you hear about this book? People are really being impacted positively by it. Oh, right.
I wonder. So a few weeks ago, I interviewed Ernest Grimm, who wrote Black History Saved My Life. I don't know if you've seen this one or not. He is actually a teacher. He's a history teacher who was the victim of a hate crime. And he since then wrote this book, and how important knowing where he came from as a Black man really influenced his ability to process and recover from that experience he had. And I'm wondering, Lionel, if we get enough momentum with books like Black History Saved My Life and books like A White Guy Confronting Racism and like How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And Ernest is a teacher, so he knows how school systems work. Maybe there's an opportunity to have a really robust conversation with a group of people to say, is there a way to come up with a collection of books that we can present to our school systems to say, here are 3 books that we would love to see you introduce into your libraries for kids or what have you. And to Jared's point, finding people who work in school systems. One of my all-time lifelong best friends is a teacher in Detroit. And I will ask him about how we might be able to get some of these books into the right hands. So you might be onto something there, Lionel, and I will use every tool I have to see if we can help make it happen. And any of you watching today, or if you're watching the replay on YouTube, we've got to use the voices and the connections and the networks and the power we do have to make the changes that need to be made. And if it's, and I love what you said, Jared, one person at a time, because sometimes that's how you get the groundswell of a movement. It's one person who has an experience, who tells another person, who tells another person. And the big grand marketing campaigns are wonderful, but sometimes we have to go about it in multiple different ways. There's not just a silver bullet that's going to take it all down, right? We've got to attack it in multiple different ways. So I think it's great if we can start having some pockets of these types of conversations, but also getting the books and the lessons into the right hands. So I love it. Maybe you'll create a workbook.
Maybe. You've given me a homework assignment, Barbie.
I'm really good at that, by the way. I'm really good at delegating to other people. So thank you, guys. We have gone over, and I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you, Jared. We could talk for hours. Again, I just want to quickly make sure everybody knows jaredkarol.com. If you're looking for someone to come in and augment or help lift your DE&I practice or your strategy, I highly encourage you to reach out to Jared through his website. Connect with him on LinkedIn. He also has a white guy confronting racism.com. The book is phenomenal. It's an easy to read book, so I highly encourage you to do that. And then he is also on his day job, a full-time senior DE&I specialist for translator.com. So you can find him in so many different places. I thank you so very much for being here with me today. I love it. I will definitely invite you back. We'll have lots more conversations. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This was really, really great. Appreciate it. Stay tuned next week for my friend and author, Andy Storch. Andy wrote a book called Own Your Career, Own Your Life. He is a keynote speaker, and he is a cancer survivor. A very recent cancer survivor, and he's just a great, great person and can really help connect people to their purpose and finding the career that helps them thrive. And so I hope you guys will join us next week for that conversation. Jared, thank you again. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.